Welcome to Reddit Aliens. What is something that you've experienced that is completely true, but you cannot rationally explain? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. One night in my apartment, I was dead asleep, probably in the middle of a REM cycle, when all of a sudden I woke up. It almost felt like something woke me up. Immediately, I felt this insane urge to get out of bed. Like in my head, I just thought, I need to get out of bed right now. I followed this strange thought, and nearly 3 seconds later, a huge centipede fell from my ceiling onto my pillow, exactly where my face would have been if I hadn't moved. One morning, my commute to university, I noticed the same car behind me every day for about a week. I tried to brush it off, but paranoia began to set in. I would abruptly change lanes, take a different route to school, or drive slow enough for traffic to go around me. Still, the sedan was in my rearview mirror. The following morning, I simply pulled into a Walmart parking lot and sat in my car for 20 minutes. The vehicle following me did the same. Then I slowly drove my car towards the parked sedan to get a look at the driver or license plate. The car peeled out and drove off. I never saw it again. I tried to tell the story to friends and family, but it definitely makes me sound crazy. It's been several years since, and I still have no idea what they would have been after. I know we can all fall into complacency on our mundane drives, but good for you for noticing that. Could have stopped a bad day. Was about 8 or 9 years of age when this happened. I spent the week at my cousin's, which about 2 years younger, and we would ride his four-wheeler deep into the New Mexico desert to hunt rabbits and other small critters with BB guns before sundown. We overdid ourselves and drove for 2 effing hours into the desert. I know, we were idiots, what do you expect? And the path we were on was slowly but surely fading. I considered turning back since I feared losing the path and getting us lost, but we both smelled a dense stench of a rotting animal. We hopped off the four-wheeler, BB gun in arms, and pursued the scent. It didn't take long until we found the source, and sure enough, they were intestines dumped inside a white bucket which was poorly buried into the sand. The heat wasn't any help either. I can't recall what being those intestines were previously possessed by, but the damn things were leaking out of the bucket and were already getting shredded up by maggots the size of our then tiny little kid pinkies. We got bored and decided to shoot them with our puny little BB guns until we ran out of BBs and once again succumbed to boredom. We saw a small camper about half a mile away, so we rode to it. We arrived minutes later and we were greeted by the same horrible stench. We decided to look for the source, and we realized it was clearly coming from inside the camper. The camper from the outside was clearly trashed up, so we figured nobody was home, or was going to be home for that matter. But unfortunately, we were wrong. We saw that the camper's window was shattered, and so we decided to give a peek. At the same time, we peeked our heads into the camper, and were both jump scared by a really thin-faced man who popped his head out of the window playfully saying, "Peekaboo." We were already both on the run, but could still hear the faint peekaboo yards behind us. We stopped when we figured we were safe distance, and we scoped out the camper before heading back to the four-wheelers because, yes, our adrenaline only commanded our bodies to run and not hop onto the effing four-wheeler. Now we had no other choice but to sneak back and ride out of this place out in the middle of effing nowhere. My little cousin was clearly not up for the plan and was about to have a panic attack, but I figured it was best for us to stick together. The closer we got, the higher the tension rose. We were once again close enough to see that no head was protruding from the window, which soothed our fear ever so slightly. We were mere feet away from the four-wheeler when we heard giggling come from inside the four-wheeler. I tried my best to ignore it, and so did my cousin, but I could see that he was on the brink of crying for my auntie to come get us. But I couldn't blame him, so was I. But we could do nothing. Again, the face inside slowly popped half of his head out of the camper, almost identical to the way a crocodile does in the water, and moved his eyeballs left and right like they do in cartoons. We noticed this motion had stopped, and that they were now staring right at us. I felt like my body was going to freeze up, but I kept going, only hoping to get away from the man out in the middle of effing nowhere. He would lower his head out of view, then would pop his head back out of the window with a different expression on his face every time, like a clown. The only difference being he wasn't making any goofy noises. By then, I was already atop our only vehicle of escape when I realized my cousin's face was pale and his legs were getting wobbly. The mother effer was going to pass out. He was about 2 yards behind, and I ran to him and pulled him onto the four-wheeler with me so he could get the F away from the sicko in the camper who kept repeating the same action as if he was stuck in a loop. Luckily, the keys were still in the ignition, and I drove us back to the path we were on, not wanting to look at the man's face for another second. My little cousin was out cold on the ride home, and I let him sleep it out some more once we finally got home. I decided to stay the night once more to help comfort him and to watch over him since I knew his parents wouldn't believe either one of us. We never went on another hunt again. Trauma is an excellent teacher. It's not really creepy, at least I don't think so. My grandpa told me this story of how they put a music box type thing under the table so when his mom stepped on a very specific spot on the floor, it would play the bit of the song. I can't remember all the details, but I always thought it was a funny story. Well, my grandpa passed away not too long ago. I was having a rough pregnant day, so stayed home from church and was watching a pastor and my grandpa liked on TV. As I'm sitting there watching TV and ignoring how loud my upstairs neighbor is walking around, I hear music from a music box. It was quick and just a few measures, but I paused my show and listened. Then I turned on the show, my neighbor walking so loud, and I heard it again. This time, I start to scan my room, and I look up at the top of the shelf, and I see my ballerina snow globe that plays music. My grandpa gave it to me. Scientifically, based on the fact my neighbor doesn't usually tromp around like an elephant where they had been that day, it is completely logical to me that the vibration hit the shelf just right and caused it to move the mechanism. But it still made me smile and remember one of my favorite stories my grandpa told. I was super young when this happened, so the details for me are fuzzy, but I've heard this several times from my mom and my grandmother. When I was little, around 4 to 5, we were living in my grandparents' house. Now, weird things have always happened in that house, dating all the way back to when my mom was a child, so this was just another thing in a long history of strange occurrences. When we lived there, I had 2 imaginary friends named Chris and Ben. I only have vague memories of Chris because he was very mean to me. The way my mom tells it, I would clear paths for them, leave space for them at the dinner table, and generally only interact with them. This started to worry my grandparents because they are very religious, and demons are a thing, I guess. My mom started to worry when one day I started screaming, telling her that Chris was attacking me while trying to hit at my back. My mom and grandparents decided they needed to clean out the house because they were convinced something evil was in the house, but they didn't tell me they were going to do it. After they cleaned the house out, I approached my mom and asked her why Chris and Ben were sitting next to the dumpster. Anyway, that's how my family became convinced that evil spirits latched onto me as a child. My dad and I were working late, and while driving we saw a crazy light show. Looked like it was 20 miles away, in the middle of the desert. Looked like a giant firework went off, and in the middle of the explosion the lights all spun and returned to the middle and disappeared. Like suddenly flushed, but very quickly. All happened within 3 seconds. Looked awesome, but no idea what could do that. Arizona has crazy light shows all the time. I had driven to university with one of 2 sets of car keys for my car. After a long day of classes, I returned to my vehicle to find my keys were no longer in my pocket. I went back and searched all the classrooms I'd been in that day to no avail, and had no luck with the lost and found. I bit the bullet and called my parents. They drove over with my spare key, and I hopped in and drove home. When I walked into the bedroom, there they were, my original set of keys, sitting squarely in the middle of the floor. No idea how that could have happened. Well, that's interesting, because then if both sets of keys were home, how did you drive to school? Cool. There's an area of Quebec that my mom won't go near. Now, we don't go into Canada that often, but we used to have an aunt who lived in Quebec, and she owned a cottage on a small, remote lake. My summers were spent at this cottage, and a lot of my family would also come up to visit. Behind the cottage was a huge forest that spanned for miles and miles. We used to go on hikes and remark about how untouched it was. You could easily get lost and never come out. One day, my mom, my aunt, 2 uncles, and myself, aged 13, were out on a hike heading towards a raspberry patch that we knew of when we heard a scream like nothing you had ever heard before. It was a human scream from a female, but it was so loud that we all dropped to the ground as if someone was shooting bullets. I don't know why this was the reaction we had, but down we went. All of us stood up stunned and looked around. For about 2 to 3 minutes, we looked in every direction, assuming it was something near us. The scream was like it was on top of us and all around us at the same time. If you had told me a jet fighter had passed over us 30 feet up, I would have believed you. I remember my mom suggesting we go back. This sound clearly wasn't from any animal, nor was it from a machine. It was human, very human. My uncle suggested we keep going, and everyone else kept going in further. By now, 2 to 3 minutes had passed, and we were all on edge, but we assumed it had to be something totally explainable. Then it happened. As God is my witness, I'll never forget what I saw. The scream came back, but this time it was accompanied by something. My aunt saw it first and pointed to it. Then we all saw it. About 50 feet away from us and probably 30 feet up in the air was a person gliding through the forest. It looked like someone sitting cross-legged, all in black, with long black hair. We didn't see where they started, but we could see them, or it, moving through the tree chops, just under the canopy, at what had to be 10 to 15 miles per hour. We watched as it went past, deeper and deeper into the forest. We could see about a football field's length away, and just stood there frozen, until they were out of sight. Then we ran. We ran until we were back at the cottage. My mom never went into the forest again. My uncle went out with his rifle the following day, but came back empty-handed. The cottage was sold years later, once my aunt passed away, and nothing was ever seen again. It was not a bird. It was not some pet monkey that escaped. It was a person, 100% a person, and whatever it was just flew through the forest as if it could fly on its own. My aunt went to her grave believing that it was a witch, and if you had told me for certain it really would answer a lot of things. To give you an idea of how it looked, think The Girl from the Ring, only in all black. I'll go to my grave wondering what I saw. I hope one day I get an answer. At probably like 1 to 2 a.m. one day, I have a sleep disorder, so I was fully awake. I wasn't one of those half-asleep dream things. I was in the kitchen making hot chocolate, and I started hearing a squeaking noise from the living room, like a chair sliding on hardwood. My living room is carpeted once every few seconds. I thought it was one of my cats, so I ignored it, but it made me really uncomfortable for some reason. I noticed all of my cats were in the kitchen or laundry room beside me, so I assumed it was a dog. She squeaks when she sleeps sometimes, so I woke her up because it was freaking me out. It still kept going. I went out to the living room to try to figure it out, and it went quiet for a minute. Then I heard it from the dining room. I went out there, and then it came from the kitchen. It was never in the room I was in. I ended up calling my best friend because I started having a panic attack. Haven't heard it since that night. I also am completely terrified of this one specific room in my basement for no reason, but it feels like I'm suffocating any time I go in there. One of my cats absolutely hates even going down the stairs, so that's not really reassuring. I do know someone died in my house in the past, so that's a great thought too. I've got a few, but I'll do them separately so it's not TLDR. The first one happened when my brother and I were like 16. I went to bed with my door open and fell asleep listening to the living room TV and my family talking. I only reached that stage of sleep where you're basically unconscious, but you can still hear everything around you, when I heard a deep male voice say, "Hey, baby," in a dramatically seductive tone. I sat up real quick and immediately saw this really short thing at the foot of my bed, laying on its side, propped up on one elbow like it was in deep thought. It was like the size of a small child, but very fat and muscular, with a pig-like gargoyle-style head topped with ram horns, and had almost metallic-looking bronze skin. As soon as I blinked, it was gone, without a single trace, not even an imprint on the sheets where it was laying, despite it looking very heavy for its size. I immediately noticed that not only was the living room TV off now, but looking out into the whole house was dark, and everyone seemed to be in bed. I grabbed a pillow and darted out to the sofa to sleep, but found my brother passed out there instead. I didn't think too much of it, since I figured he'd fallen asleep watching TV and slept in the love seat instead. In the morning, we kind of woke each other up, and he asked me why I'd come out to sleep in the living room. I told him I had this weird lucid dream where a creepy little dude was on my bed trying to seduce me, and the color drained from his face. He told me he'd come back out to sleep on the sofa because he had a lucid dream where a super attractive woman came into his room and kept trying to seduce him. But the more he resisted her, the uglier she got, until she was unearthly hideous. He tried to leave his room multiple times, but kept getting teleported back into his bed. Eventually, he was able to exit the room, and he made it to the dining room, but it charged at him and threw him all the way across the dining room into the living room, where he landed on the computer desk. He said it was so real, he felt the horrible pain from the impact, and swore that when he fell asleep, the computer desk was on its side. Everything that was on it went everywhere, and the computer was destroyed, but it looked untouched. He said he had to crawl to the sofa because both his legs were broken, and he covered himself up with a blanket until it left him alone. But he was perfectly fine now. I genuinely don't think he's lying. My brother has a very dry sense of humor and is a man of very little words. He doesn't share regalia stories or open up about things that involve him having emotions. The look of sheer confusion and terror on his face when he said, "I was screaming as loud as I could, and the desk was so loud. How did you not hear any of that?" completely confirmed to me that he wasn't making it up.
So a couple of demons try to seduce you and your brother on the same night? That's pretty wild.